Chapter 7, Part 4, 5, and 6 of a History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 7, Parts 4, 5, and 6. Section 4. Battle of Salamis. Having thus succeeded in breaking through the inner gate of Hellas and slain the king of the leading state, Xerxes continued his way and passed from Locris into Phocis and thence into Boeotia, meeting with no resistance. The Thebans and most of the other Boeotians now, unable to do otherwise, submitted to the Persians. The loss of Thermopylae forced them to this course, as the abandonment of Tempe had forced the Thessalians. In later days a story was told at Delphi that a Persian band detached itself from the main host in Phocis in order to proceed to Pytho and plunder the shrine of the god. I think, says Herodotus, that Xerxes knew its treasures better than his own. The Delphins fled up into the heights of Parnassus, leaving only 60 men and the prophet Acaratius in the temple. They did not remove the treasures, for the god said that he would protect his own. As soon as the barbarians approached, marvels began to happen. The prophet saw the sacred arms, which no man might touch, lying in front of the temple, carried out by some mysterious means. And when the Persians came to the shrine of Athena Pronaea, which stood not far from the Castilian fountain, lightning flashed. 2 crags rent from Parnassus fell with a large crash, crushing many of them, and a war whoop was heard from Athena's temple. The barbarians fled in terror, and told how 2 hoplites of superhuman size pursued them. These were Phalacius and Autonaus, the native heroes of Delphi. Such was the legend told at Delphi of the Persian invasion. When the Athenians returned from Artemisium, they found that the main body of the Peloponnesian army was gathered at the isthmus and engaged in building a wall from sea to sea, instead of advancing to the defense of Boeotia as had been previously arranged. Thus Boeotia and Attica were unprotected. Themistocles and his Athenian colleagues decided to evacuate Athens. They made a proclamation that all citizens should embark in the triremes, and that all who could should convey their families and belongings to places of safety. This was done. The women and children were transported to Troezen, Aegina, and Salamis. The council of Areopagus helped at this crisis by distributing from the treasury of Athena 8 drachmae to each citizen who embarked. At the same time, the great natural strength of the Acropolis, though its walls had been demolished after the expulsion of the tyrants, encouraged the hope that it might be held against the Persians, and a small garrison was left to defend it. This bold and wise policy of embarkation was dictated by the circumstances, but it was supposed to have been based on an oracle which foretold the utter destruction of Attica with the sole exception of a wooden wall. The wooden wall was interpreted to mean the ships, and to suit this view it was represented that the garrison left on the Acropolis was merely a handful of poor citizens who remained behind and barricaded themselves there because they adopted the more literal interpretation of a wooden barricade. This explanation of the oracle was perhaps suggested by subsequent events. While the Athenians were thus showing that they were not bound to their soil, the allied fleet had stationed itself in the bay of Salamis, and it was reinforced by new contingents, so that it reached the total strength of 378 triremes and 7 pentaconters. The army at the isthmus was now placed under the command of Cleombrotus, brother of Leonidas and guardian of his son Pleistarchus, who was still a child. Xerxes arrived at Athens about the same time that his fleet sailed into the roadstead of Phaleron. He found the town empty but for a small band which had entrenched itself on the Acropolis. Persian troops occupied the lower height of the Areopagus, which is severed from the Acropolis by a broad saddle, and succeeded in setting the wooden barricades on fire by means of burning arrows. The garrison rolled stones down on them, and such is the natural strength of the Acropolis that the siege lasted 2 weeks. Then the Persians managed to ascend on the precipitous north side by the secret path which emerged close to the shrine of Aglaris. The Greeks were slain, the temples plundered and burnt. After the fall of the Acropolis, the Greek generals held a council of war, and it was carried by the votes of the majority that they should retreat to the Isthmus and await there the attack of the Persian fleet. The advantage of this seemed to be that they would be in close touch with the land forces and have the Peloponnesus as a retreat in case of defeat, whereas at Salamis they would be entirely cut off. This decision meant the abandonment of Aegina, Salamis, and Megara, and it was strenuously opposed by the Aegintians, Athenians, and Megarians. Themistocles determined to thwart it. He went privately to Eurybiadus and convinced him that it would be much more advantageous to fight in the narrow waters of the Salamian Channel than in the open bay of the Isthmus, where the superior speed and number of the hostile ships would tell. A new council was summoned, at which, it is said, hot words passed between the Athenian and Corinthian general. When Themistocles opened the debate without waiting for the formal introduction of Eurybiades, the Corinthian Adeimantus said, "O Themistocles, those who stand up too soon in the games are whipped." "Yes," was the reply, "but those who start late are not crowned." It is recorded that Themistocles, in order to carry his point, had to threaten that the Athenians, who were half the fleet, would cease to cooperate with their allies and seek new homes in some western land if the retreat to the Isthmus were decided. Themistocles won his way, and when it was resolved to fight in Salaminian waters, the heroes of the island, Ajax and Telamon, were invoked, and a ship was sent to Aegina to fetch the other Aeacid heroes. Of all the tales of signs and marvels which befell in those memorable days, none perhaps was more attractive to the Athenians than the experience of two Greek exiles as they walked in the Thriasian plain. One was an Athenian named Decius, and his companion was none other than Demaratus, the Spartan king who had sought refuge at the Persian court. As they went, they saw a great dust afar off near Eleusis, such a dust as they thought might be raised by a host of 30,000 men, and then they heard a voice suddenly from the midst of the dust, and it sounded like the cry of the mystic Aeacus, which is cried at the Eleusinian festival. Demaratus asked his companion what it might be. "It is a token," said Decius, "of some great disaster to the king's host; for since the plain is desolate of men, it is clear that the thing which uttereth the cry is divine, and it is a thing coming from Eleusis to help the Athenians. If it turn to the Peloponnese, the peril menaces the army of the land, but if it wend towards the ships, then are the king's ships endangered." "Peace," said Demaratus, "for if these words of thine come to the king's ears thou shalt lose thy head." Then the dust wherein the voice was turned to a cloud, and rising aloft moved towards the Greek fleet at Salamis, and so they knew that the fleet of Xerxes was doomed. Meanwhile the Persians too had deliberated and determined to fight. According to a Halicarnassian story told by Herodotus, the Carian queen Artemisia alone gave sound advice, not to risk a sea fight, but either to wait for the Greek fleet to disperse from want of provisions, or to advance by land into the Peloponnese. The southern entrance to the narrow sound between Salamis and Attica is blocked by the islet of Pistalia and the long promontory which runs out from Salamis towards the mainland. The Greek fleet was anchored close to the town of Salamis, north of this promontory. It would be best for the Greeks if they could lure the Persian fleet to enter the Salaminian bay so that its flank would be exposed as it sailed through the narrow waters. It would be best for the Persians if they could force the Greeks out into the open sea. Xerxes foresaw the possibility that his enemies might attempt to escape at night, and to prevent this he moved his armament so as to enclose the ingresses of the two straits on either side of Pistalia, and landed troops on that island to rescue Persians and kill Greeks who should happen to swim to its shores in the expected battle. These movements, carried out in the afternoon, alarmed the Greeks. The Peloponnesian commanders brought pressure to bear on Eurybiadus. Another council was called, and Themistocles saw that the hard-won result of his previous exertions would now be overthrown. He therefore determined on a bold stroke. Leaving the council, he dispatched a slave named Sicanus to the Persian camp, bearing a message from himself, as a well-wisher to Xerxes, that the Greeks proposed to sail away in the night. If they were prevented from doing so, a Persian victory was certain, owing to the disunion that existed in the Hellenic camp. If the Persians attacked the Greeks here as they were, the Athenians would turn against their allies. This message was believed, and Xerxes took his measures at nightfall to prevent the Greek fleet from escaping by the western straits between Salamis and the Megarid. He sent his 200 Egyptian ships to round the southern promontory of Salamis and place themselves so that they could bar the straits, and he decided to attack in the morning, a fatal decision which only the prospect of the treachery of some of his allies could have induced him to take. The Greek generals, meanwhile, were engaged in hot discussion. Suddenly Themistocles was called out from the council. It was his rival Aristides who had sailed across from Aegina and brought the news that the fleet was surrounded by the enemy. Themistocles bade Aristides inform the generals of what had happened, and the tidings was presently confirmed by a Tenian ship which deserted from the Persians. There is no reason to question the sensational accident that Aristides brought the news, but we need not suppose that this was his first return from ostracism. It seems probable that he had been sent with the ship which fetched the Aeacids from Aegina, and that he was one of the 10 Strategoi. Themistocles had managed that a naval battle should be fought at Salamis, and under the conditions most favorable to the Greeks. The position and tactics of the two armaments have been the subject of much debate. According to the poet Aeschylus, who was an eye-witness of the battle, the Persian ships were drawn up in 3 lines outside the entrance into the Sound. The extreme left wing was composed of the Ionian Greeks, while the right towards the Piraeus was the Phoenician squadron on which Xerxes chiefly relied. The Greek fleet was drawn up behind the promontory of Cynosura and facing northward, the Athenians on the left towards the town of Salamis, and the Aeginetans probably near them, and the Lacedaemonians on the right. On the opposite mainland, on shore, under Mount Aigaleos, a high throne was erected, from which Xerxes could survey the battle and watch the conduct of his men. At the break of day the Persians began to advance into the straits. The 3 lines converted their formation into 3 columns, and the Phoenicians led the way through the opening between Pastalia and the mainland. The Ionians on the left would naturally move through the smaller channel between Pastalia and Salamis. When the Phoenicians came into view, the Athenian squadron immediately advanced, assailed them in the flank, and cut them off from the rest of the fleet, driving them towards the Attic shore. The other Persian divisions crowded through the straits, and a furious melee ensued which lasted till nightfall. There was no room for the exercise of tactical skill in the crowded narrow waters, where the fairway between Cynosura and Attica is little more than a mile in breadth. The valor of the Aeginetans was conspicuous. They seemed to have completed the discomfiture of the Phoenicians and to have dispersed the Ionians. The Persians, under the eyes of their king, fought with great bravery, but they were badly generalled, and the place of combat was unfavorable to them. By sunset the great armament of Xerxes was partly destroyed, partly put out of action. Aristides, who with a force of Athenian hoplites was watching events on the shore of Salamis, crossed over to Pastalia and killed the barbarians who had been posted there by Xerxes. Among the anecdotes told about this battle, the most famous is that which was current at Halicarnassus, of the signal bravery and no less signal good fortune of the Carian queen Artemisia. She saved herself by the stratagem of attacking and sinking another Carian vessel. Those who stood round Xerxes observed the incident, but supposed the destroyed trireme to be Greek. "Sire," they said, "seest how Artemisia has sunk an enemy's ship?" And Xerxes exclaimed, "My men have become women, my women men." Section 5. Consequences of Salamis. The Greek victory at Salamis was a heavy, perhaps a decisive blow to the naval arm of the Persian power. The wrath of Xerxes against the Phoenicians was boundless. On them he had relied, and to their infidelity he ascribed the loss of the battle. His threats so frightened the remnant of the Phoenician contingent that they deserted. But the prospects of the ultimate success of the invasion were still favorable. The land army had met with no reverse, and was overwhelmingly superior in numbers. The only difficulty was to keep it supplied with provisions, and in this respect the loss of the command of the sea was a serious misfortune. The Greeks represented Xerxes as smitten with wild terror, fleeing back overland to the Hellespont, and hardly drawing breath till he reached Susa. This dramatic glorification of the victory misrepresents the situation. Xerxes was personally in no jeopardy. The real danger lay not in Attica, but in Ionia. the Persians had good reason to fear the effect which the news of the crushing defeat of their navy might have upon the Greeks of Asia; and if Xerxes dreaded anything, he dreaded the revolt which actually came to pass in the following year. It was all important for him to secure his line of retreat, while he had no intention of relinquishing his enterprise of conquering Greece. These considerations explain what happened. The Persian fleet was immediately dispatched to the Hellespont to guard the bridge and the line of retreat. The land forces were placed under the command of Mardonius, who, as the season was now advanced, determined to postpone further operations till the spring and to winter in Thessaly. A force of 60,000 men was detached to accompany Xerxes to the Hellespont. When he arrived there, he found that the bridge had been destroyed by storms, the same storms which had wrecked his ships off Magnesia. The fleet took him across to Abydos, and he proceeded to Sardis, which he made his headquarters. The convoy of 60,000 soldiers returned to the main army in Thessaly, and on their way they laid siege to two towns which afterwards became famous on the Palline Isthmus, Olynthus and Potidæa. Olynthus, then a Boeotian town, was taken and handed over to the Chalcidians, who remained faithful to Persia. Potidæa successfully withstood a siege of 3 months. Meanwhile the Greeks had failed to follow up their victory. Cleombrotus was about to advance from the isthmus with the purpose of aiming a blow at the retreating columns of the Persian forces before they reached Boeotia. But as he was sacrificing before setting out, 2 hours after noon on the 2nd of October, the sun was totally eclipsed, and this ill omen made him desist from his plan and march back to the Peloponnesus. Themistocles tried to induce the naval commanders to follow up their advantage by sailing after the Persian fleet to the Hellespont, that they might deal it another blow and break down the bridge. It might be expected that, if this were done, the Greeks of Ionia would revolt. But the Peloponnesians would not consent to sail to a distant part of the world, while the isthmus was still threatened by the presence of the Persian army. The story goes that, having failed to get his advice adopted, Themistocles, with that characteristic adroitness which won the admiration of his contemporaries, determined to utilize his failure. The faithful Sicanus was sent to Xerxes, to assure the monarch of the goodwill of Themistocles, who had dissuaded the Greeks from pursuing the Persian fleet. Themistocles might expect that Xerxes, having been deceived before, would now disbelieve his announcement, and therefore hasten back with all speed to reach the Hellespont, if possible, before the Greeks. But on a later day of his life, when he was in exile, he claimed the Persian gratitude for this service. It was even represented that, with extraordinary long-sightedness or treachery, he had in his view the contingency of being driven to seek Persian help or protection against his countrymen. But the tale need not be seriously criticized. It has all the appearance of an invention suggested by subsequent adventures of the subtle Athenian. The island of Andros and the Euboean city Carystus had furnished contingents to the Persian fleet. Just as the Athenians, after the battle of Marathon, had sailed against Paros and demanded a war contribution, so now the Greeks acted against Andros and Carystus. They failed at Andros, just as Mithridates had failed at Paros. They devastated the territory of Carystus. Great was the rejoicing in Greece over the brilliant victory which was so little hoped for. The generals met at the Isthmus to distribute the booty and adjudge rewards. The Aeginetans received the choice lot of the spoil on account of their preeminent bravery, and dedicated in the temple of Delphi, on Apollo's express demand, 3 golden stars set in a mast of bronze. For bravery the Athenians were adjudged the 2nd place. Prizes were also proposed for individuals who had distinguished themselves for valor or for wisdom. In adjudging the prizes for wisdom, each captain wrote down 2 names in order of merit, and placed his tablet on the altar of Poseidon at Isthmus. The story is that each wrote his own name first, and that of Themistocles second, and consequently there was no prize, for a second could not be given unless a first were also awarded. This ingenious anecdote reflects the reputation for cleverness which had been won by Themistocles. The Corinthians who fell in the battle were buried in Salamis, and their sepulchral stele was inscribed with a simple distich, telling the stranger that Salamis, the isle of Ajax, holds us now, who once dwelled in the city of Corinth between her waters. The stone has been recently found. This is only one of many epitaphs composed by nameless author in those days of joy and sorrow in various parts of Greece, all marked by the simplicity of a great age, whose reserve, as has been said truly, is the pride of strong men under the semblance of modesty. In later days, insensible to such reserve, it became fashion to improve these epitaphs by the addition of boastful verses, which have been imposed till recently upon posterity, and the epitaphs thus disfigured were all said to be the workmanship of the poet Simonides. The exposure of these two deceptions increases our admiration for Hellas at the time of the invasion. There were men everywhere capable of writing a simple, appropriate inscription for a grave, and the tombstones of the fallen were not used for superfluous boasts. But the triumph of Hellas had nobler memorials than the unassuming verses of the tombs. The barbarian invasion affected art and literature, and inspired the creation of some of the great works of the world. Men seemed to rise at once to the sense of the high historical importance of their experience. The great poets of the day wrought it into their song. The great plastic arts alluded to it in their sculptures. Phrynichus now had a theme that he could treat without any dread of another fine. Aeschylus, who had himself fought against the Mede, made the tragedy of Xerxes the argument of a drama which still abides the one great historical play dealing with a contemporary event that exists in literature. But the Persian War produced, though not too soon, another and a greater work than the Persians. It inspired the Father of History with the theme of his book, The Contest of Europe with Asia. The theme was afloat in the air that the Trojan War was an earlier act of the same drama, that the warriors of Salamis and Plataea were fighting in the same mews as the heroes who had striven with Hector on the plain of Troy. Men might see, if they cared, this suggestion in the scenes from the two Trojan wars which were wrought by the master sculptors of Aegea to deck the pediments of the temple of Athena, whose Doric columns still stand to remind us that Aegina once upon a time was one of the great states of Greece. And in other temples, friezes and pediments spoke in the conventional language of sculptured legend, by the symbols of lapiths and centaurs, gods and titans, of the struggle of Greek and barbarian. Section 6. Preparations for another campaign. The words of the poet Aeschylus that the defeat of the Persian sea host was the defeat of the land host too, were perfectly true for the hour, but only for the hour. The army, compelled after Salamis to retreat to the north, spent the winter in the plains of Thessaly, and was ready for action, though unsupported by a fleet, for the following spring. The liberty of Greece was in greater jeopardy than ever, and the chances were that the success of Salamis could be utterly undone. For in the first place the Greeks, especially the Lacedaemonians and Athenians, found it hard to act together. This had been shown clearly the year before, eminently on the eve of the Salaminian battle. The Peloponnesian interests of the Lacedaemonians rendered them unwilling to meet the enemy in northern Greece, while the northern Greeks, unless they were supported from the Peloponnesus, could not attempt a serious resistance, and were therefore driven to come to terms with the barbarians. And in the second place, if these difficulties were overcome, and a pan-Hellenic force were opposed to the Persians, the chances were adverse to the Greeks, not from the disparity of numbers, but from the deficiency of Greeks in cavalry. In spring Mardonius was joined by Artabazus and the troops who had conducted Xerxes to the Hellespont. The total number of forces now at the disposal of Mardonius is unknown. It may perhaps have been 150,000. Meanwhile the Persian fleet, 400 strong, but without the Phoenician ships, was collected at Samos, with the purpose of guarding Ionia, and a Greek squadron of 110 ships gathered at Aegina under the command of the Spartan king Leotychidus for the purpose of defending the coasts of Greece, but not intending to assume the offensive. With great difficulty some envoys from Chios induced Leotychidus to advance as far as Delos, but he could not be moved to sail further east with the view to the liberation of Ionia, for Samos seemed as far away as the Pillars of Hercules, and he dreaded the Persian waters teeming with unknown dangers. It seems probable that Athenian policy was working upon the Spartan admiral's inexperience in military affairs. The object of the Athenians was to secure their own land against a second Persian occupation. They therefore desired the protection of the fleet for their coasts. But there was a more important consideration still. If the fleet took the offensive and gained another naval victory, the Peloponnesus would be practically secured against a Persian attack, defended at once by a victorious navy and the fortifications of the Isthmus. The result would be that the Peloponnesians would refuse to take any further part in the defence of northern Greece, and would leave Athens a prey to the army of Mardonius. It was therefore the policy of the Athenians to keep the fleet inactive until the war should have been decided by a battle on land, and for this reason they equipped only a few of their ships. Mardonius, well aware of this fatal division of interests between the Athenians and Peloponnesians, made a politic attempt to withdraw Athens from the Greek league. He sent an honorable ambassador, King Alexander of Macedon himself, with the most generous offers. He undertook to repair all the injuries suffered by Athens from the Persian occupation, to help her gain new territory, and asked only for her alliance as an equal and independent power. In a desolated land, amid the ruins of their city and its temples, knowing well that their allies, indifferent to the fate of Attica, were busy in completing the walls of the isthmus, the Athenians might be sorely tempted to lend an ear to these seductive overtures. Had they done so, the fate of Peloponnesus would have been sealed, as the Lacedaemonians knew. Accordingly, envoys were sent from Sparta to counteract the negotiations of Alexander, and to offer Athens material help in the privations which she was suffering. Tempting as the proposals of Mardonius sounded, in good reason, as they had to depend little on the co-operation of their allies, the Athenians were constrained by that instinct of freedom which made them a great people to decline the Persian offer. "Tell Mardonius," they said to Alexander, "that the Athenians say, 'So long as the sun moves in its present course, we will never come to terms with Xerxes.'" This answer utters the spirit of Europe in the eternal question between the East and the West, the spirit of the Senate when Hannibal was at the gates of Rome, the spirit of Roman and Goth when they met the riders of Attila on the Catalaunian plain. Thus the embassy of Alexander ought to have strengthened rather than weakened the Greek league. It ought to have made the Lacedaemonians more actively conscious of the importance of Athenian cooperation, and consequently readier to cooperate with Athens. It enabled Athens to exert stronger pressure on the Peloponnesians with a view to the defence of northern Greece, and the Spartan envoys promised that an army should march into Boeotia. But still stronger pressure was needed to overcome the selfish policy of the Peloponnesians. Soon after the embassy of Alexander they had completed the walling of the isthmus, and, feeling secure, they took no thought of fulfilling their promise. The Spartans alleged in excuse the festival of the Hyacinthia, just as before they had pleaded the Carnia. And in the meantime Mardonius had set his army in motion and advanced into Boeotia with the purpose of reoccupying Attica. Once more the Athenians had been cruelly deceived by their allies. Once more they had to leave their land and remove their families and property to the refuge of Salamis. Mardonius reached Athens without burning or harrying. He still hoped to detach the Athenians from the Greek cause. Herein lay his best chance of success. If they would now accept his former offers, he would retreat from their land, leaving it unravaged. But even at this extremity, under the bitter disappointment of the ill faith of their allies, the Athenians rejected the insidious propositions which were laid by an envoy before the council of the 500 at Salamis. Immediately the three northern states which had not yielded to the Mede, Athens, Megara, and Plataea, sent ambassadors to Sparta to insist upon an army marching at once to oppose Mardonius in Attica, a tardy redemption of their promises, with the threat that otherwise there would be nothing for it but to come to terms with the foe. Even now the narrow Peloponnesian policy of the ephors almost betrayed Greece. For 10 days, it is said, they postponed answering the ambassadors, and would have ultimately refused to do anything but for the intervention of a man of Tegea named Chelios, who impressively pointed out that the alliance of the Athenian power with the Persians would render the Isthmian fortifications on which the ephors relied absolutely useless. One would have fancied that this was obvious even to an ephor, without a prophet from Tegea to teach him. However it happened, the Lacedaemonian government suddenly changed its policy and dispatched a force of 5,000 Spartans, each attended by some Helots, to northern Greece. Never since, never perhaps before, did so large a body of Spartan citizens take the field at once. They were followed by 5,000 Perioeci, each attended by one Helot. It was clear that Sparta had risen at last to an adequate sense of the jeopardy of the Peloponnesus. The command was entrusted to Pausanias, who was acting as regent for his child cousin Pleistarchus, son of the hero of Thermopylae. At the isthmus the Lacedaemonian army was joined by the troops of the Peloponnesian allies and the contingents from Euboea, Aegina, and western Greece. and in the Megarid they were reinforced by the Megarians, and at Eleusis by Aristides, in command of 8,000 Athenians and 600 Plataeans. It was entirely an army of foot soldiers, and the total number, including light armed troops, may have approached 100,000. The task of leading this host devolved upon Pausanias. The strong fortress of Thebes, which he had abundantly supplied with provisions, was the base of Mardonius, and once the Greek army was in the field, he could not run the risk of having his communications with his base broken off and finding himself shut up in Attica, a land exhausted by the devastation of the preceding autumn. Accordingly he withdrew into Boeotia, having completed the ruin of Athens, and having sent a detachment to make a demonstration in the Megarid. He did not take the direct route to Thebes, but marching northwards to Decalia, and by the north side of Mount Parnes, he reached Tanagra and the plain of Esopus. Marching up this stream westward, he came to the spot where it is crossed by the road from Athens to Thebes, at the point where that road descends from the heights of Cithaeron. The river Esopus was the boundary between the Theban and Plataean territories, and the destruction of Plataea was probably an object of the Persians. But the main purpose of Mardonius in posting himself on the Esopus was that he might fight with Thebes behind him. The Persians had every cause to be sanguine. Not only had they superior, though not overwhelmingly superior forces, but they had a general who was far abler than any commander on the side of the Greeks. Mardonius was not anxious to bring on a battle. He fully realized that his true strategy was to do as little as possible. He knew that the longer the army of the Greeks remained in the field, the more would its cohesion be relaxed through the jealousies and dissensions of the various contingents. We need not take too seriously the story which the Greeks were afterwards fain to believe, that at this moment there was a certain dispiritedness and foreboding of disaster in the Persian camp. An anecdote told by one of the guests at a Theban banquet was thought to illustrate this gloomy mood. Antigonus, a Theban general, made a feast in honor of Mardonius. 100 guests were present, arranged on double couches, a Persian and a Boeotian on each. Thersander of Orchomenus was among the guests, and in after days he told the historian Herodotus that his Persian couchfellows spoke these words to him: "Since we have now shared the same table and wine, I wish to leave thee a memorial of my opinion, that being forewarned thou mayest look to thine own welfare. Seest thou these Persians feasting, and the host which we left encamped by the river? In a little while thou shalt see few of these remaining." The Persians shed tears as he spoke, and Thersander rejoined, "It behooves thee to tell this to Mardonius." But the Persian said, "Stranger, man cannot avert what God hath ordained. No one would believe me. Many of us Persians know it, and follow the army under constraint. No human affliction is worse than this, to know and to be helpless." Mardonius had taken up his position and constructed a fortification on the north bank of the river Esopus, before the Greek army had crossed the Cithaeron. His plan was to act on the defensive. He would wait for the Greeks to attack him, so that the issue might be tried in a plain, when he would be able to reap the full advantage of his superiority in cavalry. It would, on the contrary, be to the interests of the Greeks, when they descended from Cithaeron, if they could by any means entice the enemy to give battle on the rough and high ground south of the river, where the cavalry would be of little use. End of Chapter 7, Parts 4, 5, and 6.